Welcome to Presentational and Interpersonal Communication for Classical Languages, Part 1. Building on the previous Classical Languages webinar on Standard 1, Interpretive Communication, we will dive into two output standards, Standard 2, Presentational Communication, and Standard 3, Interpersonal Communication. Participants will explore ways to create engaging context for students to share their proficiency in the target language in presentational writing and speaking, as well as interpersonal speaking. We will consider a variety of presentational and interpersonal strategies integrated in the context of thematic lessons. Our workshop presenter today is David Pellegrino. David has taught middle and high school level Latin and Spanish for 33 years and recently retired from Pittsford Mendon High School. While teaching full-time, he was the department leader of the World Language Department at Pittsford Mendon High School for over 20 years. Over the course of his career, he has presented many pedagogical workshops and continues to do so both at the local and national levels. He is currently the treasurer of the Classical Association of the Empire State. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to invite David to begin this next workshop in the 2025 New York State World Languages Professional Learning Series entitled Presentational and Interpersonal Communication for Classical Languages, Part 1.
Thank you so much, Candy. Just want to make sure that you're still hearing me because I just switched to my headset. We're doing okay? Great, thank you. All right, well, thank you so much, Candy, again for today and for all your efforts at the State Education Department on our behalf. And thank you, everyone, today for being here. I'd also like to thank Bill Heller and Joanne O'Toole for all their support in helping me bring to you this workshop catered to classical language teachers. Today, as Candy said, we are focusing on presentational and interpersonal communication for classical languages and how you can fit those into units that you already have and you already do with your students. Here is another workshop that's coming up on Tuesday, April 8th from 4 to 5 p.m. On creating meaningful communication, communicative contexts. And you have the information there. And if you're interested in that, you can sign up for that. Here are symbols that you may be familiar with. Please keep your microphone on mute. There may be some moments where we ask you to think alone. That's the thought bubble. Please don't put anything in the chat or unmute. Just be thinking. If we do invite you to put something into the chat, we will show you that green chat bubble. When content is made available in our Google folder, you will see the folder icon. If you have any technical issues, as Candy said, or if you have any questions that are not for the whole group, just direct them to Candace Black at the State Education Department. If you're having technical difficulties, it's most likely on your end. Again, please don't use the chat while I'm delivering content in order not to distract the other participants. So let's introduce the goals for today's session. I can explain what is meant by the wording of the New York State Classical Language Standards 2 and 3, Presentational and Interpersonal Communication. I can identify strategies for designing and managing meaningful presentational and interpersonal tasks. I can identify scaffolds to help learners develop a repertoire of functional language. I can identify examples of presentational speaking or writing and interpersonal tasks in a lesson sequence. Here are the revised New York State Classical Language Standards for Communication. As I said before, we will be talking about presentational and interpersonal communication. And on this slide, here are the revised New York State culture standards. And of course, culture is integrated into everything that we do as classical language teachers. So let's dive into presentational communication. Here is the official definition. Learners present information and ideas on a variety of topics, adapted to various audiences of listeners, readers, or viewers to describe, inform, narrate, explain, or persuade. Classical language teachers certainly focus a preponderance of their time on interpretive communication, which is an input standard. Presentational communication is an output standard. It is a one-way communication, which is what I'm doing right now, at least until I take your questions at the end. Then it becomes interpersonal. So at this point, it's presentational. One-way communication without access to the interlocutor or to the audience. It could be speaking or writing. Of course, there has to be attention to the audience. Who is going to be listening or who is going to be reading? That's part of the context. Presentational can be on demand, as when we assess our students at the end of a unit or at the end of a year. Presentational can also include opportunities for drafts, revision, and practice ahead of time. We do these during our daily lessons, where we are focusing on more formative assessments as opposed to summative. Let's unpack these functions for a moment. As you can see on the left, the presentational language functions are the different purposes for using language to describe plans, places, scenes, inform, provide details, make recommendations, give reasons, narrate stories, past actions, myths, explain, could be summarize ideas, provide examples, make comparisons, or finally persuade, convincing someone, supporting a claim, giving a warning. The examples given here for each of the functions are not exhaustive, but just meant to give you some ideas. Of course, we're going to anchor our presentation activities with the New York State Classical Language themes and topics. And here are 3 of those themes: identity and family life, physical environment, geography and travel, and daily life and societal institutions. And here are the other 3: history, government and politics, religion, myths and legends, and literature, language, and art. And these, of course, are in your Google folder. For presentational speaking, students at checkpoint A should be able to perform without scaffolds at novice mid. Students at checkpoint B and C at novice high without scaffolds. For presentational writing, students at checkpoint A should be able to perform without scaffolds at novice mid. Students at checkpoint B, novice high, and C at intermediate low. Of course, this is all without scaffolds. When we scaffold our activities, students hopefully will be able to perform at a higher level. But this is what we expect at basically at the end of the year, when students are doing their assessments and there's no scaffolding involved. Here we have the performance indicators for presentational communication. Presentational speaking at the top and presentational writing at the bottom. I know this is very small, but rest assured, it's in that Google Drive. Since those performance indicators were so small, let's look closely at what we want New York State Classical Language students to be able to do without scaffolds. Students at novice mid should be using a mixture of simple, practiced, or memorized words, phrases, and even sentences if they are practiced and or memorized, while they present on very familiar and everyday topics. Students at novice high should be using simple sentences most of the time, series of sentences most of the time, while they present on familiar and everyday topics. Of course, you can expect students to use features of novice mid peppered in because you can't always be at novice high all the time. And also, that's not necessarily everyday speech. Students at intermediate low should be able to create their own simple sentences while they present on familiar and everyday topics. Again, you can expect students to use feature of lower level skills peppered in. So let's transition to designing presentational tasks. I'm going to ground these presentational tasks in a thematic unit, one they haven't seen before, because I want to give you new content to use. The examples are going to be in Latin, but certainly you can adapt the ideas here to another classical language like Ancient Greek. It's a Checkpoint A thematic unit called A Hero's Journey, and you will have a copy of it in your folder. In this thematic unit, you can see that it's organized into 3 sequential segments, starting with Perseus's departure, with links to information and images of Perseus, Danae, and Polydectes, with links to passages that I wrote with elements taken from Ovid. Those are all linked here. Don't worry, you're going to get a PDF of all these slides with those links intact. The next segment is the initiation of Perseus, where he has to show how much of a hero he really is. Again, there are links to information and images of Minerva, Mercury, and Medusa with more passages. The final segment is the return of Perseus. There are links to information and images of Andromeda, Neptune, and Ethiopia with the remaining passages. Oops, sorry. I just clicked a link. Give me a second to get out of that. Okay. On the right, we have integrated topics: family life and house, deities and traditional stories, works of art, ethics, mores, and values, and family members. So let's equip our learners to enact a specific language function. Since our learners are reading the story of Perseus, let's give them an authentic resource that is related to the story. The story that I wrote skips over Danae's imprisonment by her father, King Acrisius, and her impregnation by Jupiter. Here is a fresco from Pompeii with Cupid sending the golden rain upon Danae. Safe for school? You decide. On the right is an image from a Greek vase. It allows you to explain why Danae and Perseus in a box arrive at the island of Seriphos. It also allows you to have students write or say what they see in Latin words and phrases. You can create a can-do statement in this way. I can plus a function plus a contents plus a context by acceptable evidence. And I'll give you my sample can-do statement that relates to this unit. I can describe details of a scene, that's our function, from a Greek vase, that's our context, by speaking or writing, that's your choice, Latin words and phrases for fellow classmates, and that's our acceptable evidence. My question is, how can I help my students perform even better than at the novice mid level? Well, you can use grammar and context strategies to identify structures needed to carry out the language function required by the task. This is that scaffolding that I keep referencing. You can be gender specific and use the equivalent of this is with a masculine noun, or this is with a feminine noun, or this is with a neuter noun. Or you can just use est with a singular noun and sunt with a plural noun. Much easier, and you're still helping students perform at the sentence level. Here is a great place to equip students with very natural language to say things like, "Who is it? I don't know." Or, "What is it? I don't know." Because that's inevitably what students are going to want to say when they come across certain things in authentic images. Now it's time to define the task and establish expectations. It's really important in this day and age to identify and give specific examples of acceptable uses of composition tools, including dictionaries, online resources, and translators. You, as a professional, are going to make these decisions based on your students and your experience with your students, your own vision for using these tools, and your school policies that you have about these tools, or even departmental expectations to lay out for the students what they can use, what's acceptable, and what's not. What are the ethical uses of dictionaries and translators? And what are non-ethical uses of these tools? And then you make those expectations clear. Finally, restate what the task is with all the expectations that you've defined very carefully, and then you set them loose to start working on the task. So let's look at that image again that's on the Greek vase. Here are some example responses that students should be able to give using the scaffolds that I shared before. Of course, we want students to use Latin words and phrases to describe what they see in this scene on a Greek vase. So we could have them say, "A box," or "This is a box." 4 people, there are 4 people. There is 1 baby, or just 1 baby. There is an enslaved man, a mother, a boy, a stick, and maybe other things too. On this slide, at the top, you can see a student giving a presentation by speaking in front of the class. Of course, this can be done from the seat with more than 1 student speaking. At the bottom, you can see a student writing, which is what we officially call presentational writing. The great thing about presentational speaking and writing is that they can be formative, daily, scaffolded, and fun, because in this way, students will grow with all that anxiety that accompanies high stakes, summative assessments. The more we do these things on a daily basis or a weekly basis, the more comfortable students are going to be to do these things for us when it's time for them to show what they can do. I'm just going to show you some images that I've collected that you can use throughout the unit for presentational tasks. Here is that first image. You can see the Greek vase with its image flattened out that I showed you before. And on the right is that original shape. On this slide, on the left, we see Perseus bowing to Mercury and Minerva. On the right, we see Perseus escaping with Minerva's head in his bag, with Minerva on the right providing some kind of support for him. From a Pompeian fresco, we have Perseus with a sword in his right hand and Medusa's head in his left. On the right, we see Perseus pelting the sea monster with stones. Somebody tell him to use Medusa's head. It'll be a lot easier. Here we have a beautiful mosaic depicting Andromeda, freed from the chains on the cliff, with Perseus holding her arm and hand. Yes, there is a reason that I did not show you more of that mosaic. Yeah, cropping images can be very important to keep things safe at school. On the right, it's a bit hard to see at this size, but we have Perseus in the middle, holding Medusa's head in his right hand. Of course, that's your left. Perseus is looking away, which he should be doing that. And we've got Polydectes and his guests looking at the head. Of course, they are doomed. They are going to be turned to stone. Let's look at a couple examples of presentational writing tasks. But first, how do we manage those presentational tasks? Well, we can employ a sequence of strategies to guide our students in carrying out those tasks. We group these as pre, during, and post-task strategies. We have some pre-presentational strategies that I'd like to share with you. We're going to select a task that corresponds to the targeted language function. We're going to equip our learners to enact the specific language function that we're targeting. We're going to model successful task completion. We're going to provide those scaffolds and supports. And then we're going to define the task and establish our expectations. We do all these things up front to help our learners be as successful as they possibly can be. So, after selecting a task that corresponds with the language function that is targeted in our unit, and after equipping them with specific language functions that they need, we can model successful task completion. One way to do that is with presentational tasks. One way to do that with presentational tasks is by examining work samples, often called anchor papers, together with the students. We can also use recordings or demonstrations to model what the task should look like. If you haven't done this before, you're going to have to create these on your own. You can create a model of what you want it to look like. If you've done this task before and you have student samples that you saved, you can use these samples to show students to give them an idea of what good performance looks like. This also is the time where you can let them know your expectations by giving them the rubric that you're going to use. You can distribute and apply the assessment rubric to those anchor papers or your sample tasks. In this way, you show them how the anchor papers address each of the elements or the dimensions of the rubric. The master rubrics are going to be in your handouts folder. Okay, so let me introduce you to my graffiti wall project. Throughout the unit, the students will be using words and phrases from the text, and they're going to take it from what they've been reading. And the scaffolds are going to actually come from the text itself, and it's going to come from other students, and it's going to come from you as the teacher. So what we want students to do is we want them to describe characters and events that they encounter in their text. And that's what the graffiti wall is going to be all about. So we're going to start out by having learners write short descriptions of characters that they meet as they read. I envision this as an ongoing activity throughout the unit for the students to reinforce structures and vocabulary that they are learning along the way. It also helps them remember the characters in the story. Here are some examples that I wrote using the reading text as a basis. Now, you can have learners start working on the task. During the task, you're going to facilitate opportunities for initial drafting or composition. You're going to support the learners in carrying out the communicative task, and you're going to facilitate peer and teacher feedback. This can be through various rehearsals and iterations and revisions of the drafting that took place in that first step. We should allow time for initial drafting and support so that we can support our learners in carrying out the task. It can be a written draft or just an outline. You'll want them to do this in class because it's important, and you'll want them to devote the necessary time. Most importantly, because it's happening in class, you'll be able to monitor the student progress, provide assistance when necessary, and guide students in using scaffolds and supports, including graphic organizers. Graphic organizers, as an example, could be an outline which the student uses to be able to speak or to write about a certain topic. You can, if you want, provide a checklist of essential elements to be included in the task. It could be grammatical structures that lend themselves to that task. It could be genre characteristics if you're having students do a brochure or a letter, for example. Oops, sorry. Let's go back for a second. Length and discourse type, written or spoken, are things that you'll want to delineate explicitly for your students. Okay, let's talk about feedback. Let's give them multiple opportunities to share drafts with one or more classmates. If it's a spoken task, we can walk around and they can walk around and share what they're going to say with different partners and get feedback. And of course, the teacher is always listening as well. If you're asking peers to give feedback, it's helpful to give them something specific to look for. Oops, sorry, keep doing that. Let me just go back for a second. If you're asking peers to give feedback, it's helpful to give them something specific to look for using guide questions like, do you understand the image? What kind of praise can you offer? Those are often called warm comments. Do you have helpful suggestions? Those are those cool comments. You also might want to provide time for revision and representation to different peers and eventually to the teacher. Okay, so let's go back to that graffiti wall. The students will use words and phrases to create their own graffiti. So this is something different that's based on what they did earlier. So they're going to create their own graffiti to describe themselves. The information can be true or fabricated. This is just my opinion, but I would like students to use words and phrases from readings wherever possible, with additional words that they need to describe themselves. After getting feedback from their peers and their teachers, students are ready to publish. Here is an example of a graffiti wall that I created using names of my former students. I also see students creating these sentences over and over again as they see words in the reading passages that speak to them. Okay, now let's look at post-presentational strategies. We want to provide an opportunity for learners to self-assess, to create a forum for sharing work with an audience, and to assess that task performance. First of all, you're going to want to restate the purpose of the task and check to see if the task is completed using the identified language function. You can do this by having students look at their own work to see if they have fulfilled everything in your description of the task. You can also invite the students to self-assess using a checklist that you give them, or you can even give them the rubric and allow them to self-assess with that. Another powerful thing that you can do is give them some time to reflect on what they enjoyed about the activity and maybe even what was difficult along the way. This allows them to reflect on their own learning. Finally, you're going to create a forum for sharing this work with an audience. This allows them to show off their work. And also, they are more likely to put more effort into that self-assessment and revision process because they know that other people other than the teacher, are going to look at them. You could also use chart paper and have a gallery walk, or you could have students use online formats like Flip or Padlet. You create a fair. You could create a fair or an assembly like a poetry slam if we're doing something at a higher level. And they could do that to present their work. Of course, this would all depend on what your expectations are. For the graffiti wall, I would do chart paper or Padlet or a combination of the two. Finally, it's time to assess the product and give the students some feedback. You can use the rubric you gave them way back in the pre-task stage, or you could use one like this on the right. On this rubric, there are spots for including warm and cool comments to help them make improvements or just to help them level up. You will also see that there is a novice high column on this sample rubric. That is for when students exceed expectations. These comments can be a springboard for brief individual conferences with students. And we all know that when we have a high number of students in our classes, it's difficult to have a conference with individual students, but they can be brief. And if you have everything delineated on your rubric, it will go a lot faster. Okay, we are doing really well here because that was supposed to be half of my presentation, and we're just a little bit more than half. So we are going to switch to Interpersonal Communication Standard 3. So let's look at the definition of that standard. Learners interact and negotiate meaning in spoken, visual, or written conversations to exchange information and express feelings, preferences, and opinions. Okay. Give me 1 second here. Okay. Interpersonal communication is the most cognitively demanding of the 3 modes of communication in that it is done spontaneously and requires both input and output by the conversation partners or the interlocutors. The interlocutors receive input, and in processing the input, they focus on meaning and not form. Both interlocutors then provide output, and then meaning is negotiated in real time, either in speech, with some gestures, or through synchronous text messaging. There is a lot happening here in real time. within a short period of time. Okay, so let's take a closer look at this notion of language functions. A language function is a purpose for using language. There are 4 functions that are described here. Exchanging information, like asking and telling about feelings, asking and telling about health, or offering gratitude. Expressing preferences. I skipped one. Hang on a second. Let's go back to exchanging information. Okay, let's start at the top. Exchanging information, like greetings and goodbyes, asking and giving personal information, or asking and giving locations. I already did the express feelings, so let's do the preferences. Preferences like telling your likes and dislikes, making a request, asking for or giving advice. And then finally, those opinions like agreeing or disagreeing, making comparisons, expressing enthusiasm, or even criticism. So, how well do classical language learners have to perform? For checkpoints A and B, the expectation is novice mid. For checkpoint C, it's novice high. Of course, these are minimum expectations. Depending on the nature of your program, your students may be able to go beyond this. Students at novice mid use practiced and memorized expressions, words and phrases. Students at novice high mix in more simple sentences and simple questions. So, what does this look like at each proficiency level? It's characterized in greater detail in the Performance Indicators document, which you will find in the workshop folder. This document gives a description of the types of tasks that learners should be able to do and how well they should be able to do them at each proficiency benchmark. These performance indicators will give you a basis for designing proficiency-based rubrics to assess student progress. This is my first time using that thought bubble. So let's all think about this. What are the challenges to facilitating interpersonal communication? According to Bill Heller and others, I'm sure, I have to agree, facilitating interpersonal communication in the classroom is the most challenging of all the 3 communication standards. There are many different challenges that teachers face when trying to facilitate it. So again, what are your challenges? I'm going to give you a moment to think about it. Okay, well, I'll give you a partial list, and you can see if any of these correspond with what you were thinking. Getting students to stay on task. If you have them talking all at once, all around the room, it can be chaos sometimes. But as long as students are on task for the most part, a little chaos is okay. Having them stay in the target language, that is a major issue, and that can be facilitated best by ensuring the availability of appropriate scaffolding, and I'll share some techniques for that. The fear of speaking. Some students don't like to speak at all, even in their own first language, let alone in a different language. And young people can be really self-conscious about making mistakes. I'm certainly still waiting for that to go away completely for myself. Motivation is a key for any of the modes. And conversation is a lost art. Boy, is that certainly the case. It is difficult for students to take part in conversations, and they don't always know what to say. Our culture is evolving in terms of mediating a lot of things through stuff like emojis and text messaging. And so conversation's tough for some kids. Oops. Assessment of interpersonal speaking is always an issue because of the need to assess them individually, even when they are speaking in pairs or trios. It's also a time-consuming task. And then at the end, I was trying to keep it hidden, but I clicked too fast. Of course, the students are going to bring up, why are we speaking a dead language? My answer is always that it's important to use any language fully, and we use that language to reinforce what is learned using different modes of communication. And the more students are using vocabulary in different ways and structures in different ways, the better they are uh, going to know those things. Okay, so I've got a lot to share with you here. Um, I would like to recommend the overarching strategy of conversational elements. These are memorized words and phrases that help move a conversation along. You'll want to introduce specific ones that are keyed to what you want students to be able to do. Here are some examples in Latin and in English, but you should be able to adapt these to any classical language. One component of interpersonal speaking that we saw earlier is exchanging information. Here are some conversational elements which will help students. Hello and goodbye are a perfect way to start or end a conversation. And so we want those things to be very rehearsed and ready to go. What? I don't understand. This is something that we all use to get clarification or repetition of something. What is your name? My name is. This is part of that introducing oneself that is key in exchanging information for that first time. Kids are always asking how old they are, and they're often very proud to say how old they are. So here's that. Where is and where are great ways, great simple ways to ask for direction. I could go on and on here, but you get the idea. You could put these kinds of things into Gimkit, whatever ones that you want students to practice, whatever you want them to be able to use. Gimkit and Bloopkit and other online games like that can really help students practice these things. And of course, it tricks them because they think they're having fun, they think they're playing a game, but they're really practicing what we want them to practice. Another component of interpersonal speaking is expressing feelings. Here are some examples of conversational elements in that category. How are you today? And some sample answers. I'm doing pretty well. I'm not doing badly. And of course, what's in parentheses can be put in or left out. I'm not doing well. I'm doing badly for those who are not doing so well. Thank you and you're welcome are things that we want to have students be ready to say automatically. Let's have these things on the tips of their tongues. Okay. Expressing preferences, or more simply, likes and dislikes. That's another component of interpersonal speaking. I like or I don't like to do something. I like or I don't like something singular, or I like or I don't like something plural. asking questions. Do you like to do something? Do you like something singular? Do you like something plural? These are all things that you can have students practice and memorize and be ready to use when you need them to express their preferences. Expressing opinions is another component of interpersonal speaking. Yes and no seems pretty simple, but that's one way to express opinions. The simplest question that you can ask is she or is he? And then some other ones. What kind of man is he? What kind of boy is he? Woman, girl, person. You can use the word qualis or something equivalent in a different language to have students express their opinion about people that they see in their readings. Um, Answers to those questions can just be he is or she is. Doesn't have to be anything complicated, or he is or she is not. Now, I don't know if you do this with your students, but I always worry about indirect statement. Indirect statement at checkpoint A is pretty difficult. And so I teach my students to use something like secundum me, according to me, which is basically the equivalent of I think. And then you can have a regular subject and a regular verb, and you don't have to worry about a complicated indirect statement, which is kind of nice. You can also just use credo and non credo, I believe or I don't believe, parenthetically. So you can say, she is a brave woman, I believe. And you're using that I believe parenthetically. And then you don't have to worry about that complicated use of the indirect statement. Okay. And reactions. Here are some reactions that you could use. I know. I don't know. What are you saying? Seriously? Really? Well done. Bravo. And I don't know if you know this, but I hear you is a great way to say that you agree with someone. I've seen it in Plautus, and so I think we should use it. I don't hear you is another way that you can just say I don't agree with you. And that's pretty cool because now you don't have to worry about complicated vocabulary. These are simple vocabulary words that they have seen over and over again, just used in a different way. Okay, so let's prepare to have our students participate in some interpersonal communication. We're going to start with some can-do statements, which are created using the formula I can plus a function plus a context. Here's my first one. I can express opinions, that's my function, relating to characters and events in the Perseus myth, that's our context, in conversations with classmates. And here's my second one. I can express feelings relating to characters and events in the Perseus myth in conversations with classmates. Okay, so here is an opportunity for a fabricated conversation. You can also call this a guided conversation. It depends on what you use in your school. Even though this is presentational in nature, as you can see at the top, this kind of activity can serve as a scaffold for students to prepare for unrehearsed interpersonal conversations. So, after reading about this in their passages, students can work in pairs or trios to create a fabricated conversation where they come up with names for each other, introduce themselves, ask how everyone is, discuss what they think about Cassiopeia, Andromeda, and Neptune, and his daughters. We can also help them with a chat map, like this one in Latin. You can do this in another classical language as well. This helps them find the words and phrases and sentences that they want to use to complete the task. And now that I'm looking at the slide, it doesn't have a Google folder at the top. We'll make sure that you get this. I'll give this to Bill so he can add it to the folder. Another thing that you could do is to have students use what I call a guided conversation. This is the guided conversation. I didn't mean the one from before. I got them confused. So a guided conversation, if they're preparing this guided conversation ahead of time, of course it's going to be more on the presentational side. However, once they get used to this kind of thing with sufficient practice, they can be handed this cold to do immediately. And that's when it is more interpersonal. So here we go. As you can see, the students are going to greet each other. They're going to ask how each one is, but you can see how it's guided because you have student A and student B asking questions and performing conversational tasks. So you can ask what kind of person Perseus is, and you're going to teach them Qualis, of course, responding to that by saying that he is brave and strong. And then student A asks or adds that Andromeda is also brave, I think, using that credo or secundum me that I showed you earlier. And finally, they say goodbye to each other. And that's a guided conversation where you actually tell students basically what to say and when to say it. And then they do it in the target language. You can also use an illustration related to a portion of the story about which they have already read. You can ask students to get together in pairs or trios to have them discuss how Danae and her father might be feeling. I'm looking at this picture myself, and you can see that the father is turning his head away from his daughter. Can't imagine what that's like. Anyway, I digress. Finally, you could have a full class conversation about the conflicted emotions of the person pushing the box into the sea. You can see at the bottom, right here, some of the scaffolds that I would give to my own students to help them be able to have this full class conversation so that they can talk about certain adjectives going with certain people, and those are the scaffolds that I would use to help them. Okay. Here is another image relating to the near end of our story. You can ask students to get together in pairs and trios again to have them discuss how the dinner guests and Polydectes might be feeling. Then you could have a full class discussion about Perseus's emotions. And here at the bottom, there are some scaffolds to help the students with the things that they might want to say. And I do want to interject here that students are going to ask you if they can say different things. And I certainly, as a teacher, would help them say those things as long as they relate to the task at hand. These are just a few examples. I couldn't possibly give you everything. Okay, So this slide has a sample rubric to assess or to have students self-assess how well the interpersonal tasks in the unit were performed. There are 3 columns. I know they're small, but it's in the Google folder. Novice low is the first column after communication, discourse type, etc. Novice mid, and then novice high. Novice low basically means doesn't quite meet the expectations for the task. Novice mid means the student meets those expectations. Novice high basically says that the student exceeds the expectations for the task. This rubric, like the one I showed you for presentational tasks, has spots for including warm and cool comments to help them make improvements or to help them level up. These comments can be a springboard for brief individual conferences with students. And as I said before, with larger classes, these are difficult, but they are important to do whenever you can because students relish feedback and they want to know how well they did. They want to know what they need to work on, and students really do benefit from those individual conferences. So try to do those whenever you possibly can. Wow, we really got through these slides more quickly than I thought, but that's okay. We have a few minutes to kind of debrief. So how did we do on our goals today? I can explain what is meant by the wording of New York State Classical Language Standards 2 and 3. I can identify strategies for designing and managing meaningful presentational and interpersonal tasks. I can identify scaffolds to help learners develop a repertoire of functional language. And finally, I can identify examples of presentational speaking or writing and interpersonal tasks in a lesson sequence. And one more click, and we'll get questions in the chat or comments in the chat. And my colleagues will help me with those comments or questions. Thank you so much, everybody.